The year was 1786, as a simple need for debtor relief escalated to a powerful drive for attention to be given to the farmers and workers of Massachusetts who disapproved of the heavy, unneeded, and unmanageable taxation of the newly powerful state government was set up by the newly enacted Articles of Confederation. This proved essential to the realization of the ineffectiveness of the Articles and the need and demand for a more permanent and balanced legislature. Through the hard work and determination of many men, this intention was turned to action. However, one man in particular led the rebellion in a direction that would sustain it much longer than if it had been left rooted in disaster and violence. This man has become synonymous with the rebellion that now shares his name. The conflict today is known as Daniel Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays was born in the year 1747 in Middlesex County in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. His father, Patrick Shays, had immigrated from Ireland in the 1730s and married his wife, Margaret Dempsey, in 1744. Together they set up house in Hopkin, Mass., and in 1744 Daniel Shays was born, the second child in a family soon to be 6. Not much was recorded of Daniel Shays' early life. However, as a boy, similar to the others who did not own land of their own, he hired himself out for farm work on a farm in Brookfield, where he was paid above going rate for labor and was often described as a smart, active man with much taste for the military. When boys would arrive on military training days with nothing more than wooden guns, Shay often ran drills with hearty enthusiasm. In 1772, at the age of 25, Shay married Abigail Gilbert, and in 1733 she gave birth to their first son, Daniel Jr. Other children followed, and though the exact number is not known, Shay has often commented on the difficulty of maintaining a large and expansive family. This eagerness of the military sought its course as Shay strove to participate and fight in the Revolutionary War, taking part in significant battles such as Bunker Hill, Ticonderoga, Saratoga, and Stony Point. He moved up the ranks from sergeant to lieutenant, and eventually to Captain Shays of the 5th Regiment of the Continental Army. Though his commission was not official until 1777, Shays continued to build his reputation as a courageous and respected officer. By the end of the war, he was living back in Pelham with Abigail, struggling to make ends meet with his lack of sufficient and regular pay. His military rank gave him respect among his fellow residents, mostly farmers like himself, attempting to maintain and keep their own land. Hard times did not cease, as by 1785, Shays had sold over half of his land to satisfy bills, and was still sued twice for unpaid debts in 1786. As a result of the post-war recession, Shays was not the only one suffering from financial crisis. Mass slammed farmers with heavy taxation in hopes of extinguishing war debts. The government's demand of being paid in hard money instead of goods or paper money continued to make tensions run high. Pelham joined dozens of other towns that were petitioning for debtors' relief, lowering judicial court fees and government salaries. These state regulations and taxes were the domino effect of the active Articles of Confederation, which allowed states to have significantly more powers than the compressed federal government. This balance proved to be unsuited for the efficient and effective regulations, especially with an anchor state like Massachusetts putting itself in the way of an uprising. The Mass government chose not to enact anything to help debtor relief and ignored the petitioners. The only action that was taken was the general court asking of the patience of farmers. With the government being nothing less than responsive, the residents began to take action as thousands of men marched on the Massachusetts court. These men deemed themselves regulators, as they sought to prevent courts from conveying or conducting business.
Pretty much, Daniel Shays' rebellion showed us that with a bunch of farmers able to shut down an important state like Massachusetts, we really needed a real government that could actually do something.
At this point, Daniel Shays rose to become one of the local leaders of the protest, meeting often with men at Conkey's Tavern, where they would hold meetings to discuss the situation and how to address the government's lack of action concerning constitutional reform or debtor relief policies. However, Daniel Shays could be described as a reluctant leader, not even leading his men to meet the regulators with their march on Northampton Court of Common Pleas in 1786. However, in the following months, he would prove an important role in other conflicts that would arise. In the Springfield courts, he addressed that the people's demands and grievances, and how they would not leave until the problems were addressed. Tensions were high, but Shays had the mentality and desire to keep these protests from breaking out into violence. These events led to the discussion with General William Shepard, the officer presiding over regulator issues, attempting to set up an agreement that would hopefully trade the judges abandoning their courthouses for the promise of only peaceful marches of the regulators. The success of regulators closing the Supreme Judicial Court in Springfield led to the accusation by the General Court that the act had been an assault on the sovereignty of the state government. Association with this movement soon became synonymous with Daniel Shays. Confrontations with courthouses lasted through the fall and winter months. This lasting duration caused actions to be sought from government to deal with regulator protests. These actions included the capture of many known leaders of certain rebellions, leading to tension within Shays' group that eventually spilled over to a more dynamic action as advertisements were sent encouraging militias to begin to take stands against the government.
Soldiers to go fight for them because the militia wouldn't come out for them because all the militia was basically on Daniel Shays' rebellion side. And they bribed a bunch of people who never fought in the war before to go out.
The state continued to take action as it threatened punishment for regulators and pardons for those who laid down their arms. Regardless, funding for an emergency militia rose to counter the growing protesters. In the meantime, Shays was still attempting to ultimately stay away from violence as he desperately tried to sustain his unspoken position as a mediator for both sides. It became obvious that the government was seeing the regulators as less of a nuisance and more of a rebel group. Even with his attempts to stay peaceful, winter was harsh and his men were considering the usefulness of the Springfield arsenal as it would provide defense, weapons, and shelter for the men. This march took place on January 25, 1787. 3 separate regiments approached the arsenal in roughly 1,800 men. Unfortunately, General Shepard and his men were already occupying the arsenal, fearing for its valuable contents for some time.
Tries to go take over the armory down in Springfield, but the bribed army gets there before he does, takes the guns and chases them out.
It came to the point where the regulators were willing to use force to have the general abandon his protection of the arsenal. The charging of the arsenal ultimately led to a call of fire which resulted in chaos and the abandonment of many of the men. With most of his men not being prepared to retreat or suffer wounds, Shays asked for a flag of truce under which he could obtain, bury, or care for his men. As their retreat continued, the final assault of the regulators in early February demolished their remaining will, dissolving the rebels and causing them to flee and spread to states like New Hampshire and Vermont.
And that's where Daniel Shays Highway comes in, of course, because that's the route they took to run away from the troops coming away from Springfield. Camped right up on Route 202, that little church in Pelham that we've got there. They camped out there for the night, headed up north towards Petersham, which apparently that's how you pronounce it, I learned at one point. Petersham, they got their butts kicked up there and then ran away. Most of them ended up going up to Vermont because that's where all the scary people lived, and nobody went up to Vermont to get away. Nobody would go up to Vermont to try and get them if they got there, so that was a pretty safe place to run to.
Through the spring and summer of 1887, many of the regulators, including Shays and his wife Abigail, lived a life on the run. It wasn't until Shays learned that many of the leaders who had been sentenced to death were pardoned and released to begin to settle. As this still wary lifestyle continued, the attention of Massachusetts was no longer on the regulators' rebellion, but rather on the growing popularity of the coming Philadelphia Convention and talk of a new constitution. In 1788, Shays petitioned for clemency and was granted pardon soon after. Though the regulators did not meet the success or end they hoped for, the decisions of the powerful state government provoked by the protesters prodded at the weakness easily noticed through the setup of Articles of Confederation, or simply the ineffectiveness of granting such power to state governments. Though unsuccessful, the rebellion did acknowledge the fact that if a bunch of farmers could disrupt the entire flow of a state government, then the power should not lie there. The regulators and their rebellion proved their overreaching usefulness through their indirect inspiration of the need for a more stable and balanced setup of the government, something that was not delivered through the Articles of Confederation.
About Daniel Shays?
Rebellion. Anything?
They named a road after him, didn't they? Is that all?
No. Anything else you know about him?
No.
No. Road. Road is good.
Road is